Hey guys, welcome back. This is going to be 811 Day Two's video, and we're going to kind of pick up where we left off from yesterday. So just a recap of yesterday, we took a look at a quadratic function, and we talked about putting it into its factored form. So we learned the difference between standard and factored form. We learned how to identify the degree of the polynomial, looking at both the factored form and the standard form. We learned what the coefficients were, what the leading coefficient was, and what the constant term was. And then we talked about just making a quick sketch of the polynomial to connect the x-intercepts to these factors that we saw in the factored form. All right, so we're gonna continue on, pick up where we left off. We're gonna go to this next problem, and one of the first things you'll notice about this second problem here is that we have a cubic, right? This thing has an exponent of 3. It's no longer a quadratic like it was in the previous problem. So now we're practicing finding all of those things we talked about yesterday, but with a higher order polynomial. All right. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to start by trying to find the factored form here. Okay. And we know that the factored form is going to have these parentheses being multiplied by each other. And one of the things that you'll figure out is that since this has an exponent of 3, we know the degree of the polynomial is going to be 3. And what that means for the factors is that there's going to be 3 factors, right? There's going to be 3 of these parentheses instead of just 2, right? Also notice in this one, the highest degree term is this x cubed, and the number in front of it is a 1. So that means that the leading coefficient is going to be 1, which means we're going to have a 1 in front of the factored form, right? So it'll be 1 times parentheses times parentheses times parentheses, okay? And I can go ahead and find the coefficients too. The coefficients are the numbers that are in front of the x terms and the constant term on the end, right? So we've got a 1, a negative 13, a negative 1, and a positive 13. So I'm going to go ahead and list those out. So we've got 1, negative 13, negative 1, and a positive 13 as the coefficients here. This one sometimes trips up students because they don't see the 1 in front of the x. We don't usually write that there, but just remember if it's an x by itself, there's an assumed 1 in front of it. And because it's a minus, we're going to assume that it's a negative 1. Okay, so now we've got to figure out how are we going to get this factored form here. We've got to find these factors, and we're going to do that by looking at the graph. Okay, so I'm going to go to my calculator here, and I'm going to enter in my function, and I'm going to look for those x-intercepts. All right, so I'm going to start off with that x to the third. And we got minus 13x squared. And we got minus x, and then a plus 13. I'm going to go ahead and hit graph and see what we're dealing with here. Okay, so we see one there, we see something else there. And okay, so I might want to zoom out a little bit. I see 2 x-intercepts going on here. I think there should be a third, so I'm going to zoom out just to make sure there aren't any other x-intercepts. I'm going to go to zoom. If you hit zoom and you go to option 3, that's where the zoom out feature is. And then once you get back to the screen, just hit enter and it'll zoom out. Okay. So there's my 2, and then there is a third one right over here. Okay, so just to make sure I know where those are at, I'm going to use my table feature. So I'm going to go to my table, and what I'm looking for is I'm looking for zeros in the y column. That's how I know I'm looking at an x-intercept, because every x-intercept has a y-coordinate of 0. Okay, so before we zoomed out, we saw one at negative 1 and positive 1, and I can see those here. I can see negative 1 comma 0, 1 comma 0, and then if I scroll down a little bit, right, the other one was way off to the right, so I'm going to scroll down until I see another y equals 0, and that happens right here at 13. So we have 1, negative 1, and 13. All right, so real quick, let's go back up here. So we said we had an x-intercept at negative 1. All right, and what that means for a factor is the opposite, right? That means if I have an x-intercept at negative 1, that means I'm going to have a factor of x plus 1. And since I had another x-intercept at positive 1, right? I had an x-intercept at positive 1, that means I'm going to have a factor of x minus 1. And then the other x-intercept came at positive 13. I'm not going to pull the calculator up in. We already saw it. So we had a positive 13 for an x-intercept, which means I'm going to have an x minus 13 as a factor. And there's my three factors. And if I were to multiply all of these out, if I were to set up a big box and start multiplying these out, I would get right back to the standard form of the polynomial. So I use my graph to figure out the factored form. And now I can come over here and make my quick sketch, right? So I'm gonna come over here, I'm gonna say I had an x-intercept at -1, I had another one at +1, and then I had another one over here at 13. And you'll notice like this is not to scale at all. This is just a rough sketch of what's going on with this polynomial so we can kind of see what's going on. I'm gonna go back to my graph right now to kind of get a shape. So you see we start down here, we come up, we come back down, we come back up. All right, so I'm gonna start over here. I'm gonna go up through my x-intercept here, but then I have to come back down and hit this x-intercept right here, and I'll plot these points real quick. So I'm going to come back down through this x-intercept, but then I have to come back up and I have to hit this x-intercept here, and then I'll put my arrows on because it keeps going up forever there and it keeps on going down forever there. So this gets me a good general shape, right, of the polynomial with its x-intercepts, so I can see the connection between those x-intercepts and my factors that I wrote over here. Okay, see how we're doing on time. We got 6 minutes, so we'll do the next one real quick. Do this one. So we've got a polynomial, and this one is a little bit different than the previous two problems because it's starting off in its factored form. We got all the parentheses being multiplied, so we're starting off in factored form. All right, so for a problem like this, you will not need to find the standard form of something like this. I'm not going to expect you to multiply all of this stuff out. All right, so when it starts off in its factored form like this, you do not have to go back to its standard form. All right, unless I specifically tell you. The degree of the polynomial we can find out. Remember, we can determine the degree of the polynomial by looking at all of the factors, right? So this is a factor, x minus 2 is a factor, x plus 2 is a factor, x minus 1 is a factor, x plus 1 is a factor, and x minus 5 is a factor. And we can count up how many factors we have that have an x in it. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them. So I know the degree of this polynomial is going to be a 5. Okay, so remember, we're not going to be able to see standard form unless we multiply all of these out, which would just be a bear of a problem. So I don't really want to do that for this lesson. All right. Same thing with the coefficients. We can really see the coefficients in standard form, but it's really hard to tell what the coefficients are going to be when it's in its factored form. So we're not going to worry about the coefficients for this one. Now, the leading coefficient we can see, right? So remember, that's always going to be this number that's out front of the parentheses. And since there's nothing here, we get to assume that it's a 1. So we know the leading coefficient is going to be a 1. The constant term, we can actually determine that pretty quickly by taking these numbers, right? So we got 2, 2, -1, 1, and -5. If we multiply those out, we can actually figure out what the constant term on the end is going to be. All right, so 2 times -2 is -4. -4 times -1 is +4. 4 times 1 is 4. 4 times -5 is -20, so I know the constant term will be a -20. So those three things we can figure out reasonably easily just by looking at the factored form, but the standard form and the coefficients, those would be hard to determine. Now, also using these numbers that are inside of these factors, we can determine where the x-intercepts are going to be for a quick sketch. So we have an x minus 2, so that tells me we're going to have an x-intercept at +2. So I'm going to draw that x-intercept in. This one's at +2, so it tells me we're going to have an x-intercept at -2. And I'll draw that one in. Then we've got -1, so we're going to be at +1. And then we've got a +1, so we'll be at -1. So we've got 4 x-intercepts so far. And then over here we've got a -5, so we'll have another x-intercept at +5. Okay, now to determine the shape, like, is it going to be going down over here, like what direction do we start off in? You can actually plug this into your calculator and you can look at that shape, okay, just to kind of figure out where you're supposed to start. So this one's actually going to start down here, right? So we're going to have this thing kind of going down, and then from this direction we're going to come up. We're going to go through this x-intercept, but then we got to come back down to go through this one. But then we got to come back up to go through this one. Then we got to come back down to go through this one. And then finally, we have to come back up to go through this x-intercept here, and then it's just going to keep going up forever from there. Okay, and that gets us our general shape for this one. So this one starts off in factored form, a little bit more limited than from what we can see in that factored form compared to the standard form. Okay. All right, we're going to stop the recording there because that's just over 10 minutes. We'll finish up the exercise down here at the bottom on day 3. All right. All right, guys, have a good day. Try the exercises, post in the discussion forum. Just a little bit each day. All I'm asking for is 30 minutes each day to continue your learning. All right, so keep it up. Keep trying. If you got questions, post them in the forum. Send me a message. I'll be on most days, and I can help you out. All right. Hope you're doing well. Stay safe.